Okay, cool. All right. Any questions before I start the presentation? All right. I'm excited and a little sad because this is the last presentation I'm doing for Mycology Club. Um, but maybe it's for the best, so you guys don't have to listen to me so much. Yeah, I'm graduating. So tonight we're going to be talking about medicinal mushrooms and making tinctures. Seems like it's a topic that a lot of people are interested in, given the turnout tonight. This is like twice as many people as we usually have, so it's good stuff. And before I get started, let me just say that I'm by no means an expert on any of this, and medicinal mushrooms and their benefits and biochemistry. My knowledge sort of starts and ends with ID and not dying, but I fill in the gaps along the way. So take everything with a grain of salt. It's not like hard fact. That's all I mean. And so I'm just going to start and talk about a couple pretty common mushrooms, medicinal mushrooms you'll find growing in the Northeast, a couple of which we have with us tonight. One of which is lion's mane, which seems to be a pretty popular one, also known as Hericium species or Hericium, however you want to pronounce it. And so the species you're typically going to find here in the Northeast woods is Hericium americanum in the top photo there, and Hericium coralloides in the bottom photo there. And they're pretty easy to distinguish because coralloides just has those long branches with the spines hanging down. And coralloides has, I've heard it's worse from a culinary perspective, but there hasn't been much research done on the differences between the Hericium species from a medicinal perspective. And so those are the most common ones in the Northeast. But another pretty prominent one is Hericium erinaceus, which is the one in the center there. And it just makes these big pom-pom balls. And so this is what typically gets called a species complex. So it has a cosmopolitan distribution. So you can find it on all the continents except Antarctica. And that's likely because they are separate species, but because we haven't really gotten a good chance to separate them on a molecular basis, they all just get chucked in the same group on based off of how they look, essentially. And so you'll typically find them up here growing on oak, beech, and hemlock. I've only found them growing on hemlock in the past. I know beech is a very prominent substrate for them, and I've heard them being reported from oak as well. And so Hericium erinaceus is the most prominent of these three commercially. So how's it going? So the one I have grown in this box here, the one you're typically going to get if you buy lion's mane in the store, or you get commercially produced lion's mane tincture, most of that is coming from Hericium erinaceus. And because it's so prominent commercially as a byproduct of this, that's also where a lot of the research on the health benefits have come from lion's mane, is this one species. And there are tons of medicinal compounds in all of the mushrooms I'm going to talk about tonight, but I had to limit myself. And there's probably even more we don't know about yet. But two of the most prominent ones you see associated with lion's mane are hericenones and erinacines. And so hericenones are only going to be found in the fruiting body, so the mushroom that you see there, while the erinacines are only going to be found in the mycelium, which hopefully we all know what mycelium is, the little white threads you'll find in the soil. And I'll get into why that difference is important a little more later. But why these are so significant from a medicinal perspective is because they've been associated with the building of myelin sheaths around the axons of our neurons. So if you don't know what myelin sheaths are, they're essentially this coating around the axons of neurons, which are that tail that comes off of an axon. And they're basically acting as insulation to send electrical signals along the cells. And that's how we send information throughout our body. And what typically happens as you get older is your body loses its ability to repair the myelin sheaths. And as they become degraded, you're no longer able to insulate these electrical signals, and you get some pretty bad neurodegenerative diseases as a result. And so hericenones and erinacines have been highlighted as having some potential to help alleviate some of the symptoms of neurodegenerative diseases, as well as hold off the development of them if they aren't present already. So use those lion's mane tinctures. Another one is chaga, which is somewhat common in the Northeast, not as much anymore, apparently. I don't have a wide frame of reference because I'm 21. Also known as Inonotus obliquus. And so what often is sort of a misnomer here, I'm referring to it as a medicinal mushroom, but it's not a mushroom. There's like no spores in it. It's what's known as a sclerotium. It's also not a canker, so it's not the plant's reaction to a fungal infection. These are still fungal tissues. And a sclerotium for fungi is an overwintering structure. And in the case of fungi, they're going to be formed through this hardened hyphae that becomes melanized and darkened with other pigments to protect it from UV radiation. And this sort of serves as like a nutrient reserve when unfavorable conditions arise. So you can kind of think of them like the potatoes of the mushroom. And so another thing to note about chaga is that you will only find them growing on living trees. And that is because Inonotus obliquus is what's known as a heart rot fungus. So when it infects a tree, it will start to decay the heart rot, so the internal dead wood of the tree. And because it's dead wood, the tree doesn't have a lot of options to fight the fungus, really. Yeah, and sorry. So this process of decaying the heartwood can take anywhere from 10 to 80 years. And so it's pretty likely throughout that time that unfavorable conditions will arise, whether it be drought or extreme cold. And that's where the chaga comes in to help the fungus survive. So you're typically going to find them on birch. I'm pretty sure they only occur on birch. I've never heard of them growing on anything else. And then a few of the medicinal compounds that are of interest are inotodiol, which has been associated with some anti-inflammatory properties, melanin, which in the sclerotium, it's protecting it from UV radiation, just like in human skin. But when you mix it up into water and drink it with tea, it also has some antioxidant properties. And another one that typically gets associated with the chaga is betulin and betulinic acid. And if you're familiar with the Latin for birch, betula, you may think they sound familiar. And that's because these compounds are produced in the tree and they're sequestered into the fungal tissues. And either way, they have been associated with promoting immune support and the maintenance of phagocytes and other white blood cells. So whether it's coming from the tree or the fungus, it's still a medicinal compound. And so just for a little more help on ID, I don't know where people are at on that. The bottom left photo is a good example of how you'll find it in nature, just this sort of black, hardened, almost pimple-like protrusion. And it can look like a couple cankers from other fungal infections, but the way you can really tell it apart from anything else is if you go and you rip off a piece of that, just below the surface is this cinnamon brown, almost velvet-like surface, and that's pretty diagnostic if you got that cinnamon brown. That's going to be your chaga. Yeah. And so, as I was saying, like sclerotia are only produced on living trees, and they are not a reproductive structure. So there's no spores. So what will eventually happen when the tree dies is it does produce a fruiting body. It produces what's known as a resupinate hyamenium. And so resupinate means crust-like. So it kind of forms along the tree like a crust, and they just form these pores where the spores will come from. And the reason you probably haven't seen it is because they will be produced just beneath the bark of the birch tree when it dies. And so unless you know what you're looking for, you'd have to rip off the bark to see it. And I got a quick video just for you guys to see that.
Oh, oh my God.
Chaga does not have any spores in it whatsoever, but its actual fruit body is incredibly rare, and it's what we found out in the field that day.
So we found a fruiting body. This is incredible. This is so cool.
Looked around, and then the bark was covering it. I looked in the bark, and I could see these little like specks of like this like almost kind of like shimmery silver, yellowish, reddish brown surface, and I could just see it in there, and I was like,
Yeah, I'm gonna be here for a sec. Oh,
Real cool guys. Over time it can. What typically will end up happening is it also creates opportunities for other fungi to infect, because what I didn't end up saying about heart rot is that it does not kill the tree. The heartwood is not living, so the tree's still alive. It's just the structural integrity gets messed with a lot, and it's more likely to die. I have a question.
Yeah, I've heard that chaga is also really high in oxidates.
I don't have much of a background on it from like a biochemistry perspective and the effect on the body, but I will say that for any influence it has, the antioxidant effects may offset it to a degree.
I think there's two different oxidates start with kidney stones.
Well, that's not because it's the same process. Oh, I see what you're saying. Because I was thinking about it from a reactive oxygen perspective.
I mean, like, so if you make like a bag of things that
Really?
I don't know, like, I don't know the exact math, but I just saying it was like.
Yeah, a lot of things are very high in oxalates, and they really only become problematic in particular. Especially without that water, like your body can't filter out oxalates. The main problem with them is that they tend to bind to things like calcium, which means like spinach is a good example of it has lots of oxalates and also has lots of calcium. You're not getting any of the calcium because it's bone, so it's in the system. But overall, I mean, unless you were just like absolutely down in chaga, I can't imagine the oxalates would be level.
There's one case in like China thing where a woman had cancer and she was eating chaga every day and she eventually died of kidney stones, but it's not necessary.
As long as you're not doing it every day.
Yes.
It's not even really process it. Yeah.
I don't like the idea, but that fits me.
Nobody wants to get this.
Yeah.
Like if your kidney was already impaired, which having cancer, I would assume would impair your kidneys in some way, you definitely probably. So, but assuming like you already have a fear and that it's stay away from soda, like stuff, you're probably mitigate stuff. That's what.
But if there's only one case, I would not.
Everything in moderation. Usually the best way to go. You ever heard dose makes the poison? Works for poisonous stuff too. Okay, and so the last mushroom I'll talk about briefly is reishi. And so reishi is an example of a Ganoderma species, but this is one of those situations where it's like all reishi are a Ganoderma, but not all Ganoderma are reishi. For example, the artist conch is a Ganoderma species up there, ESF, Ganoderma applanatum. But the reishi Ganoderma species are another little subset of what are typically called varnish conchs. And so the one we're going to get here in the Northeast, the one you'll find here, is species Ganoderma sugae, or the hemlock varnish. And so, as the name suggests, you will typically find them growing on hemlock trees. I haven't found them growing on anything else, but never say never. But if it's on a hemlock, that's probably a good indication. And so Ganoderma sugae, it's somewhat similar to the situation with like Hericium americanum. While that's the one available to us here, the large majority of research that's been done on the medicinal benefits of reishi and where the commercial products are coming from are from a species Ganoderma lucidum, which is native to Eurasia, so Europe and Asia. And the one that's been sort of popularized culturally for its medicinal benefits is the Yingxi. Heard of that, Ganoderma Yingxi from China? I think it's something like that.
That's the one.
Well, lucidum is the one that's cultivated typically on like a commercial scale. But in China, at least, I know that they have their separate species that has cultural significance.
We all stuff. We kind of say that we think the cell market so like cell they always examples
And so, yes, you might also see it as Ganoderma sijuanense, the Yingxi. But lucidum is typically the one you're going to see produced in commercial scales. All right. And so hemlock varnish is also another reference to its appearance. It sort of has this look almost of polished wood, and that's a pretty helpful diagnostic characteristic for ID. Another thing that you'll typically find on it, unless it's outside of the growing season, is these inflated white tips, and that is where the growth is occurring. A lot of Ganoderma species have what's known as indeterminate growth, so their growth plan is not pre-established, and they will pretty much grow out as large as the environment permits. And so if you find these out in nature and you want to sample them or take a little bit to make your own tinctures or something, it's typically best practice to only sample from those growing tips if they are present, because one, that's where the highest concentration of those medicinal compounds is going to be typically, and two, because of that indeterminate growth, they can keep growing if you leave the base. Yeah, and then a couple of the medicinal compounds that typically get associated with reishi are ganoderic acid, which is actually associated with a wide range of Ganoderma species. And they've been said to have anti-cancer, antiviral, anti-inflammatory, and antioxidant properties. And then another one that's associated with reishi, but is also associated with pretty much all of the mushrooms I've talked about tonight, are beta-glucans. And beta-glucans have kind of been like catapulted into the spotlight as this super molecule that has a wide range of benefits, some of which include limiting the absorption of cholesterol into the bloodstream, and also helping to foster the growth of beneficial gut microbes. But do keep in mind that beta-glucans are also in a wide array of fungi and even some plants. Okay, and then my final point before we get into the tincture making is this dichotomy between wild and cultivated mushrooms. This has become more of a hot topic recently as the cultivation of mushrooms has grown in popularity. And it's sort of this debate on the idea that can cultivated mushrooms provide the same medicinal and culinary experience that wild forage mushrooms do. And to kind of oversimplify and shorten things, there is a difference. And that's simply because fungi will not produce what they don't need. So when you're cultivating mushrooms at a commercial scale, you're working very hard to maintain a sterile environment with no competitors, no pathogens. And so as a result of this, the fungus is not going to be producing as many defensive compounds as you may find in the wild growing varieties. And so what's also happening here is that a lot of these defensive compounds, which are also sometimes called secondary metabolites, are also what are functioning as the medicinal compounds when we look at them from a human health perspective. So when you grow them in these sterile environments, they're going to be contributing the majority of their resources to growth and reproduction, rather than the production of these medicinal compounds. And that also brings me to my final point, which is that medicinal fungi cannot be reduced to their purified extracts, because that's typically the way things go in Western science, is we find a compound that has a useful application, and then we find ways to purify it and produce the most concentrated products possible. But if you do that with fungi, you tend to miss out on a wide array of synergistic properties that many of these medicinal compounds have. And that goes beyond the difference between a purified extract and just eating the mushroom. Even finding ways to integrate both mushroom and mycelium into your diet is really going to be the ideal way to reap the full benefits that mushrooms have to offer from a medicinal perspective. All right. I'll ask for questions quickly if anyone has anything. All right, so we'll talk about the process behind the tincture making, what I did to make the tinctures you guys are holding right now. There's 2 steps typically. You can choose to only do one of them depending on what you're feeling, how much time you got. But there's the alcohol extraction and the water extraction. For the alcohol extraction, you're going to take your mushrooms, whatever form they are. Because it was winter when I started this, we were reliant on these little spawn bags. But whatever you have, you're going to dry it out and you're going to mix it up. You can get it into a powder form. That may make things tough further down the line, but you definitely want to grind it up a little bit, just because that increases the surface for alcohol to go in and draw out all those medicinal compounds that are alcohol soluble in alcohol. Yeah, and so once they're all dried out, you'll put them in a container. You're going to completely submerge it in pure ethanol. My suggestion is always going to be Everclear, because that's probably the purest ethanol you can buy in stores. And then you're just going to leave it in a cool and dark place for 2 to 4 weeks, depending on how much time you have and how long you're willing to wait. And ideally, you're going to be shaking that container daily, or at least agitating it somewhat, or at least every other day, whatever you can really do yourself. And so once that time has elapsed, you're going to take your container, you're going to strain out as much of those mushrooms as possible, and you'll have your alcohol extract and a bunch of mushrooms soaked in alcohol. And you're going to want to keep those mushrooms for the next step, which is the water extraction. And so you can do a hot water or a cold water extraction. There are different benefits associated with each, but for time's sake, a hot water extraction definitely goes faster because you can do it in a day. So you'll take your alcohol soaked or dry mushrooms. Maybe you had another batch on the side that you're waiting for the water extraction, and you'll get them in a pot with water. And important thing, you can mess with the ratio however you want, but it's typically a good idea to have, if you're going to mix the water and alcohol extracts, to have them in a 3-to-1 ratio, water to alcohol. And so keeping that in mind and how much alcohol you may have in mind, you'll fill the pot accordingly. So you have 3 times as much water as alcohol. And once you're all set, you're gonna heat this up to somewhere between 130 to 160 Fahrenheit. If you have a crock pot, this step is much easier. We didn't, so we had to stand around the stove for a very long time. But that 130 to 160 range is pretty important here, because if it's too cold, you're not gonna be able to draw out as much of those medicinal compounds as you would like. And if it's too hot, you might degrade them. But you're gonna keep them around that temperature anywhere from 6 to 12 hours. You can even go up to 24. We were able to squeeze out 7 just with their schedules. And throughout that process, you're also going to want to stir regularly so you don't get films developing or anything like that. And so, of course, with heating up water, it's going to begin to evaporate. And so you ideally at the beginning of the process, you're having like some line marked for your water line, which is like the minimum amount of water you want to have for your final product. And so throughout the process, you'll keep refilling water to make sure all of it doesn't boil, evaporate away, and you start cooking your mushrooms. And once you think you're done, you can just take it away from the flame and strain out the mushrooms, and you're left with your alcohol and water extract. I gave them a couple hours to settle, and then I mixed them together, and you'll see like an immediate reaction because the alcohol and the water draw out different compounds. And so when you have the compounds in the water extract interacting with the alcohols, a lot of stuff will come out of solution, and you'll get this sort of foamy layer. And you're going to want to leave that in there, because that's where a lot of the medicinal compounds that you worked so hard to get are going to be. And that's also why you just make sure to shake things up before you use it, so they can go back into solution.
How much like material do you want to have for making a tincture? Like how much chocolate or like
It really depends on how much you want. I can't give you like gram numbers or anything, but like for the alcohol extract at least, I made sure that I had a container where I could put all of my mushrooms in there, fill it with alcohol, and have the alcohol at least an inch above the mushrooms still, like with this. And so the amount of mushrooms is really only going to change the concentration of your product. Because at the end of the day, I could have put like 2 sprinkles of lion's mane in here and you'd still have all that alcohol. So it's really based off of how concentrated you want it to be and how much you have available. That's all I got on the presentation. Are there any other questions?
Resources somewhere like this presentation.
I'm going to put it in the shared drive, which you can see through the Instagram link in bio or on the Engage. I don't have them in the presentation, but I can send them to you individually. That's fine. Is there anything specifically, or it was just like all of it? Is there like one point that was specifically like jumping out to you?